Those who know me know I quite like graphs and I quite like numbers. I think a bit like, when Bob Geldof organised Live Aid, the Boomtown Rats got to play. Well, if I'm organising this, I get to put some slides in front of you. What I will try and do is present them with some sort of, entertaining PowerPoint graphics. Think of it, if you like, as Dave Gorman, but without the laughs. What I'm going to try and do, numbers and pictures. And I think for an audience of this size, and we're dealing with some quite complicated numbers in some cases, I'm mainly going to try and present some pictures. Because I think people can take away pictures, people can understand shapes.
Now, we'd love your text on this. Do we believe the numbers used to describe the income and expenditure of Scotland? They're called the GERS figures, Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland. They describe in theory the taxes raised in Scotland and the money spent in and for Scotland annually.
Well, before the independence referendum in 2014, they were cited by the pro-independence movement to say that Scotland was richer than the rest of the UK, but also cited by the Better Together movement to say that without oil, Scotland was doing worse than the rest of the UK.
Now, the numbers themselves seemed then to be trusted by both sides, but that's changed as many pro-independence campaigners now say the numbers aren't to be trusted. Recently, the debate's hotted up as Professor Richard...
The rest of the UK.
The GERS report is always a tough day for the Nats. An independent Scotland would be bankrupt, poverty-stricken, miserable, mass unemployment, a horrible, horrible place to live, with a hard border. You couldn't just walk into England anymore. You'd need to apply for visas. There's no guarantee that you'd get them.
But it does get to one of the criticisms of GERS, I think one of the legitimate criticisms of GERS, in that GERS showcases Scotland versus the UK as a whole.
Yeah.
And we know that the UK is an exceptionally unequal economy, and you then get this impression that Scotland is somehow wildly out from the rest of the UK, and it's not. The UK, when you start to apportion these deficits and surpluses and you look around, it just is another way of showing how unequal the UK economy is. So you see London and the South East generating significant levels of tax revenue because that's where the city is, that's where high earners are, that's where businesses, corporate headquarters, etc., book their profits. So we know that, and that's shown up in all the data, whether that be GDP data, whether that be household income data, whether that be GNI data that the Scottish Government produce. You see that flow of activity, or that dominance of activity of London and South East, and then the rest of the UK is less equal as London and the South East. So again, one of the criticisms I think of GERS is that you lose that insight into how Scotland compares against other parts of the UK. And again, as we said, I think what we conclude is that Scotland has relatively higher public spending per head compared to other nations and regions of the UK, with the exception of Northern Ireland and London to an extent. And actually, but we also raise a relatively high level of revenue compared to other parts of the UK outside of London and the South East. And that's essentially how Scotland is, and that's how Scotland sits. You do the same calculation for places like Wales that you mentioned, even though it might have relatively less public expenditure per head, their revenues are a lot lower. Yeah. So they are notionally in a kind of position where their revenues are less than their expenditure. Same with the North East, same with the North West, etc. So that one of the challenges with GERS, and it'll be really interesting to see whether the government start to change this in time, but start to put it in the context of not just Scotland versus the UK, but Scotland relative to other nations of the UK and other English regions.
Well, no one's got a deficit like you, because of the fall. No one has a deficit like Scotland. That your deficit was 15 billion.
On their Independence Day, why don't we have a national holiday so we can celebrate the fact we don't have to subsidise Scotland?
But just come back to your first point there. Why is it
do we think that on the whole the negativity flows from Scotland to us? I mean, it was after the break, but the point you made about the subsidy that we do give and have for centuries given Scotland, you know, we help them financially. What have we done wrong?
What about our oil, Richard, just saying?
What about what?
It's such a great... No, it's really important because that's exactly the line they'll come back with every time, is what about the oil?
Well, that would have to be negotiated and some kind of fair settlement. But what have we done wrong? I mean, as you say, we give them our money. Our English taxpayers' money goes north of the border.
Can I just say something in support of the Scots, though?
Yes. I love the Scots, don't get me wrong.
Westminster's paying for your deficit, Mrs Sturgeon. Westminster's paying for the difference for the rest of the deficit. Would you like to thank the rest of the people of the United Kingdom for making up for the deficit you've got?
Completely forgetting that that you've got other parts of the UK as well. Some make a positive contribution, some make a negative contribution because of the unequal nature of the UK economy. And because you have London in the southeast sucking in so much economic activity, therefore tax revenue necessarily follows that they will be running notional estimated surpluses. So taking the ratio of the Scottish number compared to the UK number is just complete nonsensical.
So we've got our 12 NUTS 1 regions. Only 3 of those regions raise more in taxes than they spend. And those are London, the South East and the East of England, which covers mainly East Anglia and so on. So those are the areas which raise more in taxes than they spend. The other 6 regions of England, Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, all raise less in taxes than they spend on services.
If you think about it in terms of, nationalist narratives, it doesn't matter what the fiscal transfer situation is. It's always a reason for independence. Because we're contributing, because we pay our way, or because we're not contributing. And if you think about it, it's quite an extraordinary narrative that the nationalists now have to sell. Because we benefit from being in the UK, that's why we should be independent, because it proves the UK isn't working. And if I see some kind of glazed eyes in the audience, because it is a really weird argument, but that is the argument. Oh no! So, I'm going to need to have a little glass of water. Can I get a glass of water? So I'm trying to present quickly makes your mouth dry up, I've discovered. What they miss, and what a lot of this debate misses, is the really interesting things that GERS should be focused of attention, like this is what we spend our money on as a country. This is how much we spend on these different services. This is how much more we spend on education than other aspects of our public services. And do we get the right outcomes from that? Are we spending the right amount of money on things like defence as a share of our economy? Is it too high? Higher than many other countries? What could be done if you spent less than that on different aspects of the public sector? How do we tax people? Again, it's really interesting if you look at just how much tax comes off earners on income tax, on national insurance, and how much little comes off on businesses. Again, so really important questions for as a country about how you tax and the relative balance of tax. And sadly, all these issues get missed in the storm that comes around one number about whether or not Scotland's in deficit or whether that deficit is bigger or smaller than the UK. And so where you end up now today is Scotland benefits from this famous £2,000 per capita fiscal transfer, 10.7 billion, or let's say 10 billion for each.
GERS tells us that Scotland would face fiscal challenges. The UK faces fiscal challenges. We've got COVID-19, which is going to have a significant impact on the public finances of most countries around the world. We've got an ageing population with a shrinking tax base in that context and growing demand in public services. So it's going to be a challenge not just for Scotland, but it's a challenge for the UK. What GERS does do, if you take the assumption methodology in the report, it does suggest that at the start that challenge is going to be more significant. It's not to say that you can't do anything about it, it's just going to say that that challenge is there.
To those who say, surely this just shows how badly the Scottish economy performs under Westminster rule, we say no, it shows how pooling and sharing allows higher expenditure per head in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and surely that is a good thing.
So over the last 40 years, pooling and sharing of resources through the UK, causing grievance at either end, has actually meant that Scotland's got back what it gave to the rest of the UK. Pooling and sharing over those 40 years works, which is a wonderful advert for the UK, I would argue. And yet, as you can see, it's the source of grievances. Healthcare, only, in inverted commas, 5% more in healthcare. And again, there may be demographic needs, health issues, areas of endemic poverty that might explain that. But we also have free personal care in Scotland that doesn't exist in the rest of the UK. We have free prescriptions in Scotland that don't exist in the rest of the UK. It is not obvious that higher spending in Scotland can all be justified by need. It is possible that some of that higher spending in Scotland is unfair on the rest of the UK. It's possible that some of that higher spending in Scotland gets used for freebies that help people win votes.
Where the Finns beat other Nordic countries is by focusing their effort more on the poorest quarter than anything else, partly because they didn't want to leave, because nobody was coming. So if they emigrate and leave, straight after the war and during the war, one of the first things they did for school children was introduce free school meals for everybody.
We're still having that debate in the UK.
We're still having that.
Oh my God.
And even though there were some ups and downs later, people campaigned not to lose that. So they're not called free school meals, of course. They're just called school lunch. Because if everybody gets it, it's just like having a chair. Having to pay for your school meal is as stupid as having to pay for the chair you sit on at school. You have to eat, this doesn't make sense. In Helsinki, they also did meals during the holidays, which they've kept since the war. So again, no need for Marcus Rashford and so on. It's so not losing what you've gained and then arguing to improve all the time. You don't actually, it's ironic. The British want to be number one in the world, but over power and money and wealth. The countries that have actually become number 1, 2 and 3 in the world have done it by wanting to be good and decent to other people in their country.
Actually, some really interesting things in GERS that just never get discussed because it gets dominated by a debate around the fiscal position of an independent Scotland and arguments about whether or not it shows the benefits of the Union, because Scotland is, in some people's words, being subsidised and benefiting from that. In other people's eyes, it shows actually, Scotland made a significant contribution in the past through oil revenues, and actually the deficit now, or the notional estimated deficit now, is a reflection of Scotland within the Union, and therefore if you look at other small countries, why can't we be like them, successful? So both sides can interpret the same number for their own purposes. So yes, use it to inform your decision making around the constitutional debate. So does this show Scotland benefiting from being part of the UK, or does it show Scotland being held back, or does it help you make a judgment about the opportunities and also risks from different constitutional change? So if we can focus the debate on those sorts of issues rather than debates around phantom numbers being created and rogue estimates and rogue allocations, and I think we'll be in a much better place. So,
is it possible to export the Finnish model here?
It would take 2 or 3 generations to export it here. The people who are most interested, of course, are the Scots, and they're endlessly looking at Scandinavian, Nordic countries and saying we could be like them. And Scotland could be, but it would just be, their grandchildren would get that. It wouldn't be immediate. But what we can certainly do is we should be looking at other European countries.
Now, if you add those two things together, then you get the fiscal transfers. So fiscal transfers come out of London and the South East, come into the rest of the UK. And so Scotland gets 1,900, it was 2,000 on the other data, 10 billion ahead of fiscal transfer in. Northern Ireland, over £4,000 ahead. Wales, nearly £4,000 ahead. The North East, £3,500 ahead. So fiscal transfers are not unusual in the UK. Scotland isn't some exceptional case in terms of getting these fiscal transfers. And not only the devolved administrations, but the English regions, there are lots of fiscal transfers going on. And if we kind of peel back a layer, and this may be too much detail, but just to sort of check we've followed the story here, Scotland, the first bar is the revenue difference, the second bar is the spending difference, and that gets you to the fiscal transfer. So Scotland's fiscal transfer is explained by higher spending. And that's a really important point to understand in the narrative. And in contrast, the larger fiscal transfers that exist for the North East and Wales, to pick two examples, are as a result of lower revenue generation, lower economic activity, rather than greater spend. And Northern Ireland it has both. It's both lower economic and higher spend. That's why it has the largest fiscal transfer. So,
actually, and contrary to popular belief, the notional deficit is not caused by excessive public spending. Scottish spending is not excessive. Scottish spending is not high. Scotland's notional deficit is too big because the economy is too small. It's not so much the GERS report on its own that makes people think their country poor. It's the one-eyed, partial analysis and reporting of it. It's the headlines about Zimbabwe, the big scaly numbers, the reverence. The headlines come from a comparison between the Scottish and UK numbers, between the deficits. So, seeing how unionist politicians are so keen to compare UK and Scottish deficits, and to boast about the quote-unquote union dividend, a question doth arise. Why don't they ever compare their union dividend Scotland to its independent neighbours? Think about it. If the union is really better than independence, they would, non-stop. If being a part of the UK was even half as great as Tory politicians are always telling us, they'd be able to actually show us. The numbers would demonstrate how we're better off in comparison to the Scotland-sized independent countries that surround us. After all, that's the whole debate.
It's not rubbish.
Right there. The devolved union model versus the independence model. Which one works best? It would be an extremely difficult argument to counter. So why do they avoid it? The reason you never see unionist politicians comparing Scotland with its independent neighbours is, of course, they can't. Or rather, they dare not. It would be a massive own goal. It would be a kind of Gerald Ratner moment for the Union Jack. This is because GERS shows Scotland as an underperforming part of an underperforming UK. The evidence is literally all around us. Every single one of our independent neighbours has a bigger economy, richer people, and higher public spending, with all of the results for their societies that we have seen in the measures of health, wealth, and happiness. So they talk about the UK single market, the pound, the deficit, the dividend, and avoid the logical conclusion that independence is far more valuable than any of that. And if you need more evidence as to the nature of the Union's failure, you have the other devolved parts of the UK and how they do even worse, despite both having a much larger quote-unquote subsidy than Scotland. Just try comparing Northern Ireland with the Republic. As Professor Graham Roy says, GERS figures can be used by both sides. Not that you'd ever think so from the coverage. The Unionist bloggers, the Tory and Labour parties, the British press, the supposedly neutral BBC, Andrew Neil ranting away. They all talk about GERS the same way. They don't question London's stewardship of the Scottish economy or provide any badly needed context. They talk about a country needing subsidies every year to afford a higher level of public expenditure than the UK average. A subsidy presented as hard proof that we're better off together. Together with their currency and trade destination talking points, the union dividend forms a big part of the main thrust of the pro-union case against independence. But it is based on an incredibly shallow analysis of GERS, one that dissolves on contact with Google. More and more people are asking awkward questions about that presentation. Some question the methodology, the sources and estimates for the numbers. But it is international comparison that really destroys Tory claims, such that, as understanding of that context slowly spreads, their traditional smug complacency over the economic debate could become very much misplaced. Context is important, and while the analysis of GERS continues to be restricted to a curiously insular comparison of UK and Scottish figures, it's still fulfilling its original pro-union design from 1992. According to the statisticians involved, GERS methodology has evolved since then to give an ever more accurate picture. But bringing in some comprehensive international comparison should be the next step, if informing people properly truly is the goal. Wouldn't that be a good thing that surely both sides would welcome? The GERS report shows a Scottish deficit, true, a big one. And that does matter in regards to where we're starting from. It does make the initial financial picture more challenging than you'd like. But, much more than that, it shows the very high and lasting price of giving up control of your economy. A price counted in that economy being much neglected and smaller than it would be if it was run by a government that actually needed or even sought the approval of Scottish voters. And as we can't fail to see, more and more in Brexit Britain, a price counted in failing public services, poorer people with poorer prospects, poorer health, and even in earlier death. And surely, that's no dividend. That's a bad thing.
I think the best thing about being openly pro-independence is I get maybe half a dozen tweets a day telling me that I don't understand economics from Rangers fans. last one was a wee guy with a club crest as his logo going, "You're 110% wrong about this."
But it's like that idea of the Scots realising, shit, we've been conned for years.